Good afternoon. I'm Rob Sikorsky, Executive Director of the Duke University Center for International Studies. The center, which is one of the co-sponsors of today's event, is an interdisciplinary program here at Duke organized around a changing set of themes that seek to examine critical international issues. On our current agenda are feminism in global perspective, globalization, equity, and democratic governance, globalization and the artist, and emerging international health issues. Thus, I'm happy that we've been able to collaborate with the Center for Genome Ethics, Law, and Policy in organizing today's event. I'm especially pleased to be able to welcome you here today and to introduce Dr. Robert Cook Deegan, Director of the Center for Genome Ethics, Law, and Policy. Until July 2002, Bob directed the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health Policy Fellowship Program. Bob, could that be any longer? At the Institute of Medicine within the National Academy of Sciences. He is also a Robert Wood Johnson Health Policy Investigator at the Kennedy Institute of Ethics at Georgetown University, where he is currently completing a primer on how national policy decisions are made about health research. Bob is the author of the Gene Wars, Science, Politics, and the Human Genome. He chairs the Royalty Advisory Committee for the Alzheimer's Association and is Secretary and Trustee of the Foundation for Genetic Medicine. Bob was a member of the Board of Directors of Physicians for Human Rights from 1988 to 1996 and participated in human rights missions to Turkey, Iraq, and Panama. He's a graduate of Harvard College and the School of Medicine at the University of Colorado. Since coming to Duke University, Bob has quickly become a central figure in helping to foster collaboration across the disciplines. In the short time he's been here, I've seen him do a presentation to a conference organized by the English department on the one hand, and then do a presentation in a seminar that I run on globalization, equity, and democratic governance, in which his audience was exclusively social scientists. I think thus we are really fortunate to have someone like Bob at Duke who can continue to build and foster our interdisciplinary community. So this is my formal welcome to Duke. I haven't had a chance. Bob?
Thank you, Rob. I guess Rob missed my presentation at the High School for Science and Math here. I wanted to thank you all for coming, and we're going to be treated to an intellectual feast here. There's no accident that the program on feminism and world dominance has sponsored this meeting or co-sponsored this meeting. But I do want to thank, in a serious note, I want to thank the Center for International Studies and the Center for Ethics, Law, and Policy, Genome Ethics, Law, and Policy, which is part of the Institute for Genome Sciences and Policy at Duke, are the two main sponsors of this event. And I want to thank the folks who are involved with that. Some of the members of the steering committees of both groups are here. Welcome to the students from various parts of the university. Let me just walk you through, because I want to get right into the substance of what we're going to be doing. Let me walk you through what the day's going to, or the session's going to look like. For those of you who don't have it, I encourage you to go out and get the green sheet that has the list of what we're going to be going through, because it's got all sorts of information on it that might be useful for you afterwards. I'm going to introduce each speaker, but I'm actually not going. I'm going to assume that you can read what's written on the green sheet, and I'm going to try to interpret a little bit about the institutions that are associated with each person, each speaker, and give you a little bit more context of what they are bringing. But basically, we have an assembly of folks who are right at the edge of what's happening in the world assembled for us today, and they've all been generous enough to come down to Duke. So we're looking forward to having a high-level discussion, and this topic came out of interest in the Center for Genome Ethics, Law, and Policy in conjunction with what does genomics have to do with what's going to happen at the end of the process if we get these products and services that we think are going to arise out of genomics, who's going to have access to them, and a belief that we need to solve that problem. I'm not going to predict what the speakers are going to say, but I will. Let me just put one note of context on it. A lot of work on how to make the innovation system work in connection with genetics is kind of frozen in what I think is a fairly sterile debate. On the one hand saying, don't patent anything, it's natural inheritance and blah, blah, blah. And another one where if you say anything that criticizes the patent system at all, you're written off as a naive academic who doesn't really understand the system. My prediction is that most of our speakers are actually going to be in the middle zone, and that we're actually moving to a productive area of discussion where we can actually try to harness the advantages of an intellectual property system to solving concrete problems in the world. This is an incredibly hard set of problems to solve, but we do have people that are joining us today who are trying to do that, and we don't know if our center or other parts of Duke are going to be able to do more work in this area, but we certainly did want to learn from the folks that we've assembled here today to begin to think about these problems in hopes that there might be things that can be done in the real world to make that happen. One other thing I'll say about the green sheets in addition to the bios is there are some links to the reports that are going to be mentioned. The reports are also out there, the Nuffield Council report and the report from the Commission on Intellectual Property Rights that is about intellectual property on the one hand and balancing that for the development of the economies of resource-poor countries. So without going into boring you more with listening to somebody who's around here all the time anyway, let me introduce Maria Freire. And what we're going to do is Maria Freire and Sandra Thomas will give their talks, and then we have a panel of 5 folks who will be giving different perspectives on some of the same themes and some of the same issues. And so we will go directly from the talks to the panel, and then at the end of that we'll have a question and answer session. One caveat on that is 2 of the panelists have to depart at 7 o'clock for the airport. So we will direct you to Dr. Rummel and Dr. Kirsch. If you have questions for them, we'll try to put you at the top of the queue so that you can ask them questions before they have to depart for the airport. And then we'll open it up to broader questions for the other panelists and the speakers. So Maria Freire is here. She's head of the TB Alliance. And before that, she was head of the Technology Licensing Office at the National Institutes of Health. NIH is the largest single biomedical research enterprise in the world. It's the largest cluster of laboratories that are actually doing biomedical research. That Technology Licensing Office, therefore, is a place where an awful lot of new things are discovered and have to be licensed out. So, and it is also part of the U.S. government, and therefore it had an interesting dual role of actually having an operational part that had to do the licensing, but also was always under the spotlight for what was happening in national policy about technology licensing in general, not just at NIH, but at universities and for all NIH research. And Maria was the director of that office when the rubber hit the road several times. So there was a series of controversies that made it into the national media that landed on her desk. And I think she brought that kind of perspective to her job. She's now out there trying to solve the problem of developing drugs that don't have too much of a market at the back end and trying to set up incentives for doing that. And I won't co-opt any more of her talk by delving more into that. And then I will introduce Maria, if you could speak, and then I'll introduce Sandy, and then we'll go into the panel.
Good evening. Can you all hear me? I'm wired in different directions and ways, so if there's a microphone snafu, I'm going to probably be toast here. So bear with me. It's wonderful to be here, not only because Bob, as you know, has been on the forefront of many of these interesting issues, and when he invited me to come and told me who else was participating, I thought, I'm there. This is way cool, as my son would say. But also because this place is of particular importance for us and the Alliance. Certainly in my career, people like Stephen Burke, who's in the audience today, have been a beacon of light coming from the Research Triangle, as well as our friends at RTI. Without Doris Rouse's support, and to what I'm going to say today, many of the Alliance's goals and mission would not happen. Rick Satcher was here early. There he is. And I want to actually acknowledge him as well. And for those of you who are not aware of what these wonderful people are doing for us, it will become increasingly evident to you during my presentation. I'm afraid my presentation is probably long, Bob, so you're going to have to give me a timeout signal here. And I get carried away because I'm very excited about what I'm doing now. As Bob mentioned, I did head the Office of Technology Transfer for 7 years under the leadership of Harold Varmus at NIH. And it was one of the most amazing time of my life. I learned a great deal, and I couldn't have accomplished what we did without wonderful people, and some people who are here in the room, as Ted Rummel and Claire Driscoll. So the one thing that I did learn during my 7-year tenure at NIH, for sure, is that while we could transfer technologies, and we did well over 1,500 deals during that 7 year, my people did anyway, was that I could transfer things for central nervous system and I could transfer things for cancer, but I could not transfer things for malaria or for cholera or for tuberculosis. And what I'm going to describe today is an experiment, but it's an experiment that I believe is not only going to work, but we have to make work. There will be references to intellectual property, never fear, but I want to set the stage in a broader way to bring you into the dynamic of what's happening in the world today and the issues that are confronted at this stage. So they taught me how to use this, and there it is. I'm going to divide my talk into 3 parts, sort of the international backdrop, what's happening in the world, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the alliance itself and the lessons we have learned. No new drugs for tuberculosis for about 50 years. Now think about that. Think about being treated for cancer with drugs that are 30 or 50 years old. That would be unacceptable. And yet we find it perfectly acceptable to treat diseases that kill enormous numbers of people with drugs that are very old or vaccines that haven't proven to be that efficacious. But the reality today is slightly different. The science is difficult for many of these diseases, otherwise the solution would have come. We underestimated the health need. We assumed that many of these diseases would be cured, surely, by the year 2000. And we really overlooked what the market was. But the confluence of these 3 factors, the fact that we really didn't understand the world impact and need, the difficulty of the science, and the underestimation of the market, created a status quo, which then hit us in the face when many of these epidemic diseases came to the fore, particularly HIV/AIDS. So where are we today? We have scientific advances, the genome being one, and the genome of many of these infectious agents now, of course, being deciphered. We have new knowledge about what the market is about, and I'll discuss this further. But last but not least, we now understand that there is a clear public health emergency. When you have generations of people in Africa that are simply being wiped away, there is no longer any question that this is an issue that needs to be addressed. And of course, in a global village, there are no such things as geographic barriers for infectious agents. So I want to describe the space. What is the space that we found existed? Well, we knew that pharmaceutical companies were developing drugs successfully. We knew that the public sector was doing basic research, but we didn't have anybody somewhere in the middle using the strategies of the pharmaceutical industry to further products that didn't necessarily have the $1 billion mark. So we knew that we had to intervene in this space where market dynamics failed. Now, I hate to say that markets don't work. Actually, markets, in my opinion, work very, very well. The market tells you people won't buy this, therefore we won't make it. The point is that there are some things for which we shouldn't use that kind of incentive. And perhaps these infectious diseases and these technologies for these diseases is such a case. We could leverage the scientific advances. We could mobilize public investments for access. For the first time, we saw organizations like the Rockefeller Foundation and Bill Gates really putting funding behind the movement of these technologies. And of course, we learned a lot about designing these win-win agreements with the private sector. And one of the biggest lessons in this space was really bringing together the endemic countries as a true player. No longer simply, well, these are the diseases of people in developing countries and we will treat them as clinical trial patients, but actually, are there resources, are there scientists, are there technologies that arise from these countries that should be brought to the fore? So in the year 2000, people got together in South Africa and said, this can't continue. People from the public sector, the private sector, NGOs and governments said, this has got to change. We have to find a novel way of moving these technologies forward. We know the pharmaceutical companies can't take them. They have a fiduciary responsibility to their stockholders. We know the public sector isn't equipped to move the technology this way. And the alliance was created. Why tuberculosis? Well, 1/3 of the world is infected. One person dies currently today every 15 seconds. Think about it. I've been speaking for 3 or 4 minutes. Do the math. This is an enormous, enormous problem. And unlike HIV/AIDS, of course, tuberculosis is airborne and therefore very, very contagious. So there is hope in the science. We know we have the Mycobacterium genome has been sequenced. So now we can look for new targets, new ways of attacking the mycobacteria that weren't available to us before. Importantly, with tuberculosis, which isn't true of some of the other infectious agents, there's 2 parts. There's the active part of tuberculosis, in which you cough. And for those of you who saw Moulin Rouge, that's what the actress, help me, Nicole Kidman died of. What's her name? Eleanor Roosevelt is another example of somebody that had actually tuberculosis. Yeah, well, you have your priorities set up right. You know, what can I say? But there's another kind of tuberculosis that is latent tuberculosis. And one day, somehow, somewhere, that latent tuberculosis becomes active tuberculosis. So we have millions of people around the world, 8 million a year, that get infected with tuberculosis that don't necessarily show the active kind, but show the latent kind. So when you look at the genome of the active type of tuberculosis and the non-active type of tuberculosis, different genes are activated. And so for the first time, we're able to, we think we have a window to analyze and study these issues. Now, for those of you who do not know, tuberculosis, also we have a problem with multi-drug resistance. And that, indeed, MDR-TB is a bioterrorist agent. So we've got a problem. We have 50-year-old drugs, drugs that people are finding resistance to. So that's why the alliance was formed. And we have a very ambitious goal, and that is to provide new medicine with equitable access to all patients who need it around the world. And we hope to do this by the year 2010. Anybody that has done any development of drugs knows that that's a ridiculous deadline. But it has to be that way, because if we keep pushing the deadline, we will not achieve our goal. We know it's a very difficult thing to do, but we're up to the challenge, and we feel that this is something that's a moral imperative that needs to be done. Who are we? We're what is called a public-private partnership, and I have an ongoing plea to anybody that comes up with a better name than a PPP to describe these kinds of organizations. There are a handful of them. There are about 5 organizations that are set up similarly to the way we are. There's the Medicines for Malaria Venture, that's based in Geneva. There is IAVI, which people in New York that work on AIDS vaccines. There's an organization to handle microbicides. Again, the same idea, global problems handled the way a pharmaceutical would be handled. I love it when we say we have virtual R&D. Trust me, there's nothing virtual about the R&D that we do. We just don't happen to have real estate to do it in. And what we do is we contract out with other people, and this is where the RTI and Doris's leadership is so important. These are the people that actually spearhead the development of these drugs forward. Now, what we did is we had a systematic approach. We were pretending to be industry-type group, and therefore we have to do the things that people do to analyze what the market is, what the science is, and what our strategy is going to be. So in 2001, we came up with a scientific blueprint which provided this very interesting scenario. If you look at the circles in the bottom, what I'm describing here is really the research and development chain for therapeutics. You start with basic research and you go all the way to patient access. In the process, you go from basic research, which are people working in their laboratories, like here at Duke, for example, that really have not thought of developing a drug, but come up with the genome of the mycobacterium, into what is called the discovery phase and preclinical phase, the phase where you say, I think I have something and I'm going to move it forward. From there, you go into humans. But the step from going from preclinical to humans is a very big step and a very important step, because there is where you start exposing people to this new agent, and you have to make sure you do no harm. But after all of this process, that it can cost up to $800 million by some estimates in the private sector, which is not the same as our estimates, you finally get to the patient. When we did this analysis for tuberculosis, we realized, and again, these gaps do change depending on the disease, that we had some basic research, but it wasn't getting into the discovery. And when we got things in the preclinical, it wasn't getting into the clinical phase, because the cost of doing this simply did not outweigh the benefit for people that wanted to get a profit out of this. And last but certainly not least, for tuberculosis, it is a problem with patient access. In order to treat tuberculosis, you have to give a patient 4 drugs. Not 1, not 2, 4 drugs. And you have to do this for 9 months, 6 to 9 months. So think about it. What happens if you only have 3 of the 4 drugs? Or what happens if you stop taking it? You develop multi-drug resistance. So anything that can shorten the time of duration of this treatment will be an enormous benefit to public health. So when we're developing new drugs, we're looking for things that will change the profile from 9 months of treatment to 2, will treat the drug resistance that I mentioned before, and will halt the infection of latent tuberculosis. Last but certainly not least, we have to have things that we can take to the field. If we develop a drug, as wonderful as it may be, that needs to be intravenous, we lose the way because we can't take it to the field. So we did a market analysis, and what did we find? Well, interesting. People thought there was no market for tuberculosis. There is a market. It's 450 million. Maybe it's not large enough for a big pharmaceutical company, but it's an appealing market for a smaller biotech. Where is the market? Oh, I don't know what happened to that, but that's clever. What is the shape of this? Oblong shape. Shows you that 60% of the market, is this the North Carolina part chart? Yeah, somehow that got lost in the translation. But anyway, 60% of the market actually is in the private hands in endemic countries. And think about it. If you think about a country like India, for example, they have 200 million people that are middle class. And these people can afford the drugs. So RTI, again, helped us tremendously with this study, and there are other people in this room that I will put to the test when we're looking at that. So what do we need to do? We need to ensure that well, at least these are still in the right shape. The tower here to the left-hand side is normally the time it takes to get a drug to market, and what we're trying to do is reduce that time to market. And how are we trying to do this? Well, we're trying to work with things that already exist, that companies have sitting in their shelves, that universities have developed. And we're particularly interested in novel classes or families of compounds, because that's where we think the multi-drug resistance is going to happen. So we go around the world. We go to companies, we go to repositories, we go to people in academia. We search compound libraries, and we look for compounds that are of natural origin. And then we have to bring them in. And that's when intellectual property kicks in. Because a lot of these compounds and a lot of these libraries and a lot of these technologies are already owned by somebody. Or we are helping the financing of these technologies. So how do we do our deals? how we get to the core. See, what we've tried to do in the past is we've tried to use something that was already in the market or that was already used for something else and then make it fit one of these diseases of the poor. What we're doing now is a little bit different. We're saying from the start, we have money, we have resources, we have millions of dollars that Gates and Rockefeller and the Dutch government and people have given us. And with this money, we will acquire these compounds and we will fund the development of these compounds. And at the end of the day, we will make no money because we don't have to return our investment, because these are public sources of funding and they are interested in seeing a drug come to the market. So when you negotiate with us, you will know that you will make no money. How's that for an attractive sell? But it's interesting. People think that this is a very interesting model because these compounds are going nowhere fast. They're not being developed. To have somebody that has the wherewithal to move them and the resources to move them with the potential of an impact that they can take credit for right now in the world is an appealing concept. It's not easy, but it is appealing. So we structure our agreements, and I'll give you a model agreement in a minute, to identify where the win-win places for both organizations are. We know how to use intellectual property. Intellectual property for us is a strategic tool. Can it present a hurdle? Yes. But on the other hand, it also allows us to craft these agreements in a way that people are willing to give us their firstborn child, in a way that they feel that somebody understands the movement of these technologies forward. I talked about ensuring the participation of the endemic countries early because, again, they have been dealing with these diseases. These people know tuberculosis and cholera and malaria. So tapping those resources and building in provisions for technology transfer in the endemic countries have also served us very well. Kinds of deals we do? We do licenses, we sponsor projects, we outsource contracts, we do co-development, etc. And I'll be happy to talk about the anatomy of some of these deals later on. But what I'd really like to do today is give you a test case of a molecule called PAA24. I put this quotation in here, and I will stop for 1 second to allow you to read it, because I think it sort of captures the dynamic of these public-private partnerships. And this is Tom Abadi, who's the biotech columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle. I think he's keeping his finger crossed, both for the TV drugs and the larger experiment of developing drugs in a non-for-profit environment. We believe that this space that we're occupying may, in fact, prove to be the way forward. We're not saying it's simple. We're not saying that it is easy, but we are saying that we find support from the private sector and support from the public sector. And there are few times where you find that coalescence. So why are we interested in this molecule? Well, it's bactericidal, which means it kills the bacteria. And we believe it can attack latency. It is active against the multi-drug resistant strains, and it presents really one of the few novel compounds that has come out in the literature in the last few years. So this is the anatomy of our deal. Chiron acquired a company called Pathogenesis in Seattle. Pathogenesis owned these technologies. They are patent protected, and the patents have issued. The deal is an in-licensing agreement. We have a licensing agreement with Chiron by which we have a standard provision. We have upfront fees and royalties to Chiron. We have very strictly defined scientific milestones. And again, this is the work of Doris and her colleagues, particularly Rick here, that's been mapping out exactly what needs to happen with this compound. We have very specific go, no-go decisions, because drug development is difficult. So if we have a terrific molecule, but it costs us tremendous amount of money to develop, I can't put it to the market. I can't take it because people won't be able to afford it, and therefore my core mission gets thwarted. So all of these pieces need to be put together into this compendium to get it to go back. Now, what's in it for Chiron? Well, First of all, they agreed that they will not take any royalties in the developing world. Second of all, there is a grant back. If we're going to produce the PA-824, Chiron wants to be given the opportunity to come back to the alliance and compete along with others for the manufacturing rights. And if all things are equal and the bids are the same, Chiron would have a grant back option from the alliance as a preferred manufacturer. So there is some benefit. It isn't entirely a giveaway, quote unquote. There is specific milestones, specific requirements. There are no royalties for the developing world, but should the drug or one of the analogs move forward, these compounds, Chiron would have some benefit out of it. We have done deals. This is sort of a schematic of the deals we have done. The first number three, I just finished last week, which is a series of 500 compounds from Korea that we need to put through the test and movement forward. And the bottom deals have to do with animal models and clinical trials, etc. And I won't go into this. But the point I'm making with this slide is that actually people are coming to the table and we're moving things forward. So what are the lessons learned? Well, you have to know your market. If you're going to develop a therapeutic, just like you would in the for-profit sector, in the non-for-profit sector, you have to know what your market is. In the case of tuberculosis, it's 450 million. In the case of malaria, it's different. In the case of dengue, it's much smaller. We need to make a real assessment whether we need new tools, new vaccines, new therapeutics, new diagnostics, or the problem is an access to the tools. Remember, I showed you that continuum. Where's the block? If the continuum is perfectly unfettered until the very end, you don't need a new tool. What you need is an access program. And so knowing where you are and what your barriers are very important for the development of these instruments. If you are to develop a new tool, then the science and technology is extremely important. And in this case, the genome of the mycobacteria and all the infectious agents are very important. There are intellectual property hurdles. We do find ourselves having to negotiate with multiple partners for the intellectual property. Interestingly enough, of course, or it shouldn't be interesting, but it is noteworthy that the majority of the time the intellectual property is in the north or in the developed economies. People very rarely will patent in the south. And so in a way, the markets that we're seeking to address are not encumbered by intellectual property because the intellectual property doesn't exist. If you manufacture in the north, however, and you have to bring it to the south or you have other issues of intellectual property, you do need to sort those out. Certainly, financing is a big issue, but importantly, identifying who the key players are to bring the muscle behind what you need is also has been very useful for us. We can identify and attract the best science. We find that we need to develop, and this is something that we have found that's I think is novel. We don't have a roster internationally of where the best place to do these things are. Where's the best toxicology? Where's the best chemistry? Where is the best clinical testing? We can do this worldwide. Unlike a pharmaceutical company that is integrated, the Alliance is like a little speedboat. We can go to whatever port we need to go to achieve our goal. And that's actually very powerful because we can go to Brazil to do toxicology. We can go to India to do chemistry. We can go to New Jersey to do formulation. We have no problem crafting the agreements as long as the contracts are there and the capabilities are there. What we don't have, and this is something that we've been working on, is a roster. Where are there? Where are these places around the world? Advocacy is extremely important. And of course, any of these organizations need independence, accountability, and transparency. The minute that our mission gets thwarted or that we get accused of corporate welfare, we're in big trouble. So we're very sensitive to these issues. What's on the agenda for the future? Well, I think we need to coordinate some approaches for all these tools, and I won't go into it. But we can't keep PPPs, sprouting like mushrooms. We need to have maybe an international way of handling this tool development strategy. We need to start thinking of diseases in tandem. For example, tuberculosis and HIV go hand in glove. Not only that, but they have a potentiating effect on each other. So we thought that tuberculosis was going to be conquered by the year 2000. No longer is that true. And more importantly, because of the HIV pandemic, we have a resurgence of tuberculosis. And we have to ensure that certain indications are not lost. We keep hearing about HIV/AIDS appropriately, and sometimes we even hear it associated with TB and malaria, like in the Global Fund. But there are many, many indications that never see the light of day of truly neglected diseases. What we hope is that this model can be a blueprint, and that we can move forward with this blueprint for other indications. And finally, this is our website, and so if you're compelled to give your time for a worthy cause, we're always eager to have good people. Thank you very much.
So that's a tough problem and a ray of hope. We're going to shift gears a little bit now and talk about a couple of reports that have been done recently addressing the complex set of issues linking intellectual property to economic development outside of the first world and even in the first world. And the platform for that is actually two reports that Dr. Thomas has been part of. The first is from the Nuffield Council. It's on the ethics of DNA patenting. And the second is from the Commission on Intellectual Property Rights. And so we've actually asked, we've given Sandy a very tough topic, which is to try to pull these things together in a coherent form in a short period of time. But the underlying thesis here is that that her kind of expertise will be just perfect for that sort of thing. I met Sandy years ago because she was one of the very few people, there were maybe a half dozen of us around the planet that were actually paying attention to DNA patents, not as what was going on in the world, but actually as a subject of scholarship. And then the next thing I knew, she was the head of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, which for those of you who do bioethics, if there are any others in the room, it was the UK version of a National Bioethics Commission that grew out of the, it was about, a decade ago, or a little over a decade ago. So it serves as it's funded by both the government and nonprofits in the UK. And lo and behold, this person interested in DNA patents became the director of this Bioethics Commission and brought that kind of rich perspective to the set of problems that we're going to be talking about today. The Nuffield Council actually has reports on all sorts of things like international research ethics and genetically modified organisms and all that. But today we're going to be talking mainly about this one project that they've done on the ethics of DNA patenting. The references to the two reports are on the green sheet. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Sandy.
Well, good afternoon. I think I'm not quite sure which time zone I'm in, but good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And thank you, Bob, for that very kind introduction. I'm really honoured to have the opportunity to contribute to this evening. I've long been an admirer of the work that Bob and his colleagues have done, and I'm absolutely delighted that he's been able to be appointed at Duke. This is my first time to Duke. It's not my first time to North Carolina. Stephen Burke, who I'm also very pleased to see here, invited me to North Carolina to RTP some years ago, and I've been back 2 or 3 times. I've also worked with Jim Hunt a few times. I came to contribute to the Emerging Issues meeting last year. So I'm really pleased to be back here and have this opportunity, and I've had a very nice walk around Duke this afternoon, so I feel this is a further chance to get to know North Carolina. Now, this is interesting times that we live in, but what I would like to do is to try and set out the framework in which the kind of practical approach that Maria has outlined, the kind of IP framework in which science has to operate in, particularly in relation to developing new treatments, whether it's in the form of diagnostics, vaccines or medicines for neglected diseases. Now that's actually quite a difficult thing to do in the context of these two reports, but what I'm going to do is to make a few general points about the IP framework, both in relation to patenting DNA and in relation to global rules. But I'm going to refer to one report and then refer to the other and then bring them together. And I hope very much that in the discussion that follows, we'll be able to flesh out some of those points, because we're addressing a very wide range of issues here, and I'm reluctant to oversimplify too much. Now, the reason I've put this slide up here is that in March 2000, Prime Minister Blair, get this the right way around, and President Clinton issued a statement welcoming the publication of the draft human genome sequence. Now, that was quite an ironic occasion in some ways, because I think what it did is that it illustrated the fundamental tension which exists very much in the enterprise of genomics and other areas of biomedicine. And that fundamental tension is very much to do with the need to promote the sharing of knowledge, very much along the lines that, to some extent, Maria has been describing, especially in the public sector and also for the benefit of the developing world. But also at the same time, to promote innovation in health, we also have to protect inventions, and particularly gene-based inventions. So there is this tension of the sharing of knowledge on one hand and the recognition of the importance of that, but also recognition of the need to protect commercial investments. Now, another fundamental tension, I think, is illustrated at the same time by Craig Venter, who, of course, played a very active role in addressing some of these issues by participating in a private project to sequence the human genome, which essentially was in competition in many ways with the public sector project. And then this again illustrates the tensions between public sector efforts and private sector efforts, and the fact that it's actually quite difficult to both compete and collaborate to the benefit of the public interest as a whole. Now, if we think for a moment about the promise of genomics, because I'm going to say quite a bit this evening about genomics and patenting DNA, because I think this highlights for many some of the fundamental paradoxes that we see in the needs to protect inventions in biotechnology. Now, of course, the human genome has many potential applications, new and improved diagnostics, new targets for drugs and vaccines, which you've already heard about, and an improved understanding of disease, which would really fall in the category of basic research, understanding of the genome arrangements of pathogens, and also the importance of animal models. Now, there has been another recent report, which has essentially been done under the auspices of the WHO, on genomics and world health. And I think this makes three important points which should temper our considerations this evening. First of all, that expectations in the context of global health have probably been over-optimistic, that any introductions that are based on genomics must be comparative with current approaches to healthcare. In other words, there are existing technologies which could be better applied that may not necessarily relate to genomics, and that the patenting of genes, which very much promotes a culture of ownership, may heighten some of the inequalities which are already a feature of developing country healthcare. Now, the reason that the Nuffield Council undertook this report was very much to do with the tensions that were highlighted at the time of the publication of the draft sequence. The fact that the human genome was both being treated in a proprietary way by the public sector, particularly companies such as Celera, and also there were questions over access to that information. Now, doing this project was actually really extremely difficult. It took twice as long as we expected. And part of the reason for that was that the whole area of intellectual property, not just in DNA, but in other areas, is rather obscured by a lot of technical detail, both in the legal side of things in relation to patent law, which is for many people, quite a dull subject, I think, and rather arcane. But at the same time, there's the scientific aspect. So to get a group of people around who could actually concur and come up with a coherent analysis was particularly challenging. Now, in terms of the aims of that particular report, which I'm going to draw on this evening, firstly to examine the ethical and legal issues within the current regulatory framework. So we're dealing not really from very first principles, but from the principles that are essentially compatible with the current regulatory framework. And also to provide an ethical framework and policy recommendations to assist those who are in the business of making decisions about patenting to make appropriate judgments that would be both in the interest of the commercial considerations, but also in the public interest. The other report, which Bob mentioned, takes a broader look at intellectual property, not just in the questions relating to health, but in other areas too, such as copyright and education. And this particular report, which spends quite a lot of time considering access to medicines and the IP issues around that, which are really not at all straightforward, this essentially was sponsored by the British government, who felt that the the development of new global rules being adopted by developing countries needed a second look before they were adopted to see if this indeed was the right way to go. So I will, in the second part of my talk, be talking about how some of those global rules are shaping the kind of considerations that we've heard about in the first talk. Now, the aims of this particular report specifically to consider whether the rules and institutions of IP protection can contribute to development, whether they should be part of development strategy, and whether they are actually conceived in such a way that they will effect a reduction in poverty. And specifically, I'm going to consider just one part of that report, which is the role of IP in trying to combat disease. So the rest of my talk, we're going to firstly consider the context for these discussions, highlight what the issues are, look at some relevant cases to illustrate the points, and also consider some remedies along with the conclusions. Now, first of all, some general points. Clearly, patenting in biomedicine is well established. We're talking about a set of regulations that have been applied quite successfully over the last 20 years. Cell lines, DNA, proteins, antibodies, quite a long list of biological substances and organisms that have been patented. This has involved not, of course, just the commercial sector, but also increasingly universities post-Bayh-Dole. And there has been, in general, this increasing involvement of the public sector, not just in the USA, but in other countries, particularly in Europe, which seek to emulate taking forward of inventions in the public sector and transferring them to the private sector. Now, it's well established that patents play a key role in pharmaceutical innovation. I think in both the reports that I was involved with, there was no argument with that. That was essentially taken as a given. And it was also taken as a given that IP in biotechnology genomics has encouraged investment. Whether that's going to be a productive investment in terms of outcome is, I think, very much uncertain, and it's going to take a long time. But certainly for small companies, assets as IP have become important. Intellectual property rights, patents on genes, proteins, and other components are seen as assets by people trying to raise money. And overall, there are still relatively few products on the market that have come out of this particular intellectual property framework. Now, within this context, in general, we can see, and I'm thinking here particularly of biotech and biomedicine, there have been two key trends, but these also spill over into other areas of IP. And this is that we've seen increasing concern that investment should be protected, perhaps rather than inventions. If you spend your money, you should be able to get some sort of protection. And increasingly a trend towards protecting information rather than inventions. And these two trends, I would argue, are drifting across these broad areas rather than strict inventions. Now, the context in terms of developing countries relates to what we call the 1090 rule, where 10% essentially, or I could say 90%, it might be easier to say it the way around, whereas 90% of the R&D investment in healthcare is essentially spent on 10% of the world's population. So the greater part of healthcare obviously going to a very small select group of population. But clearly, genomics requires high capital investment, and global healthcare industry, as we've already heard, lacks market incentives for neglected diseases. Those markets are not going to be there. And there is a clear need for capacity building in genomics, especially for communicable diseases such as TB and others. And one of the barriers here is perceived to be intellectual property rights. Now, turning now to focus specifically on DNA, and this is referring to material that's essentially in the Nuffield report. And as I say, the way DNA relates to what we're talking about tonight, it's very much at the heart of much research which is underpinning the development of new healthcare products, whether we're talking about vaccines, whether we're talking about research tools for screening for new drugs, or whether we're talking about gene-based diagnostic kits. So the questions that we asked were, is DNA special? It's clear that it's certainly perceived to be by the public. Is it actually eligible for patenting? And does it meet the legal criteria which have been laid out by the patent system for chemical compounds for many decades? A question that was uppermost in our mind throughout all these considerations was whether patenting DNA would promote the public good rather than be seen as an instrument of the development of, for example, the biotechnology industry. And whether patents on DNA, for example, were actually unfairly rewarding inventors, whether too much emphasis these days is being given to rewarding the inventor rather than promoting the public interest. And obviously we need a balance here. Now, a key point here about eligibility of DNA patenting was whether isolated DNA sequences are considered eligible. Well, certainly most patent offices consider that this is the case. But we've seen, I think, in many areas that there have been advances in isolating DNA. And so from our perspective, that question of eligibility, whether DNA should be eligible, needed to be reopened. Now, taking one of the three main criteria for why you would be permitted to patent an invention, inventiveness, this would mean that your invention, whether it be related to a drug or a diagnostic, would not be obvious to the skilled person. Now, certainly in the case of DNA, as we've already said, it's become really quite obvious to how you might isolate a gene. And quite a lot of this is done in silico, effectively done by computer. And there are very much different approaches in Europe to the US here, that in the US some patents have been allowed essentially using computer-based approaches to identifying a gene and its function rather than actually doing the experiments. And this has been accepted in some US patents, but not in Europe. So we conclude that it was no longer inventive to actually identify a gene. Now, how useful might these patents be? Well, any invention has to be capable of industrial application. And the USPTO has actually presented new guidelines which have emphasized, and very much welcomed these, that any invention based on DNA must be specific, it must be credible, and it must be practical. And our conclusion was that this must be rigorously applied to DNA patents. And it's quite clear that many thousands of DNA patents that have been applied in the past have not had this rigorous application. Many of them, we concluded, are of doubtful validity. But I might just say as an aside there that, of course, validity isn't often going to be tested unless there's actually a court case. That once a patent is granted, unless it's actually challenged, its validity is taken as accepted. Now, in briefly looking at patents on DNA, I'm going to mention three classes: diagnostic tests, research tools, and therapeutic proteins, because I think these relate particularly to the question of access to medicines in developing countries. So let's first of all take diagnostic tests. Now, you'll be aware that many human genes have been isolated and have been used to permit a diagnosis of a disease or a susceptibility to a disease. And we looked hard and asked some basic questions here. And essentially, what is being claimed as an invention is the fact that an association exists between a gene and a disease. So a scientist makes that, what I would argue, is a discovery, and on that basis is able to claim the structure of a gene and the use of that gene on the basis of that established association. Now, this essentially, in our view, is a fact about the world. It's an association. Someone hasn't invented that, they've merely discovered it. We also took the view that this was essentially going to be obvious, that if you find this association, then it's obvious to build a diagnostic about that. And essentially, again, knowledges of mutations. There are different patents on different mutations, for example, of breast cancer or cystic fibrosis. But these essentially are discoveries of pre-existing entities. And examples exist here. There are gene-based tests, for example, one of the breast cancer genes, BRCA1, and also so another example of gene-based diagnostic tests that would be relevant to third world countries particularly would be the case of the thalassemias, which have a high incidence in a number of different countries. Now, specifically, I'm not sure what that noise was. I hope that's not on all of these. The company Myriad in the US has a monopoly on the use of the genes BRCA1 and also BRCA2. This has upset a lot of people, particularly in Europe. So at the European Patent Office, this particular patent is now being challenged. Because Myriad were the first company, essentially, or first organization to discover this particular gene, they, because of the claims, have all diagnostic uses of the gene, and those broad patents that they have will be dominant over other uses that others might discover. And of course, you can't invent around a gene sequence. You need that gene sequence on which to base your diagnostic test. And unlike different kinds of medicines that you might make to try and get around a patent on a chemical compound, you can't actually invent around a sequence in the same way. And also, these tests don't come cheap. For example, They've been costed out at over $2,000 in the UK. And Myriad has made it clear that in some countries it would consider the use of these without the licensing arrangements as an infringement. So the question then, do patents on diagnostic tests cause adverse effects? Well, this is a very difficult question to answer, and we should be aware of being glib in trying to think that these patents might not be in the public interest. Certainly, there is this difficulty of inventing around the gene sequence. They do create a powerful monopoly, there's no doubt about that. Are they actually needed? Do we need these kind of protections for these kind of inventions? Certainly, they might encourage the development of new tests, and R&D might be needed. It could be argued to invent new genes for diagnosis. But in fact, if you think about it, R&D for most of this kind of work is not actually very expensive and doesn't compare to making new medicines. So we concluded that it's going to be rare that a product patent, a patent on the gene sequence itself, could be justified, and that use patents, just using the gene, not actually claiming the gene itself, could be rarely justified if they were specific. And we also took the view that if there are existing patents, as in the case of many cystic fibrosis mutations, or in the case of breast cancer genes, that if the owner refuses a license on reasonable terms, that compulsory licensing should be sought. Now, moving quickly to another category of DNA sequences, which we would loosely call research tools. This is a growing category of patented DNA sequences. It includes fragments of DNA, which we call ESTs, small polymorphisms, which we call single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, and receptors, which essentially can be the targets for different kinds of drugs, all of which have particular DNA sequences. Now, these will fall within the category of scientific findings which have no immediate commercial or therapeutic use. So in patenting, for example, a DNA sequence as a research tool, what you're really saying is this might be useful, or it might have a fairly narrow use, and I'm going to put a patent on it. It might be useful later. And it has an early stage screening value for potential medicines and testing libraries against molecular targets, and are used at the kind of early stages that Maria described in her work. Now, the ways in which these kind of patents might inhibit innovation overall. So we're talking here about situations where we might actually have the opposite effect to which we hope the patent system might have. The cost of research might be increased because you'd have to take out lots of licenses. It might make research more difficult, and the patent owner might even not give you a license. And so you could get an effect of royalty stacking, that to develop a particular medicine, you might have to take out not just 1 or 2 licenses from companies like Chiron, but you might have to take out several. And the question is this going to matter? And one example that we looked at was in the development of malaria vaccines, where an organization called PATH was seeking to access IP, much in the way that Maria has described, in relation to antigens for particular malaria vaccines. And they found that in this group of antigens, there were 34 different patent families. And this presented for them a very complicated situation, complex and overlapping patents. And it consumed a great deal of time to negotiate their way through these. And there was obviously, a lot of uncertainty. Many of these were not well drafted. They were overlapping and had competing claims. And a very similar situation has recently been experienced in the development of golden rice, which is rice which has had daffodil genes actually transferred into it. So rice can make carotene, and it gives the rice a golden color. And a similar situation has arisen where a number of different patent owners had to be negotiated with, which actually delayed the adoption of this rice to breeders. So there are some of these examples which are not very encouraging. So we concluded that product or use patents should rarely be awarded in the case of research tools, and that as a whole they should be discouraged. And we hope that these new guidelines from the US Patent Office, which are saying that usefulness must be emphasized, will go some way to doing this. Now, of course, many patents on research tools have already been granted, several thousand. So one way of trying to make those available, particularly in the case to companies and to others who are developing products which may only have small markets, that licensing would be best if it could be non-exclusive. Obviously, this is not always in commercial interest, but also honouring this idea of a research exemption, that provided research is not initially tied to commercial exploitation, licenses should not have to be sought. Now, we have a fairly firm footing for this in many statutes in Europe, but I understand that in the US there isn't a statutory basis for this, and this is certainly something that could benefit from being looked at. Now, the last category, before I talk about global rules, was the question of therapeutic proteins. Now, many of you will be aware that in the case of early developments in biotechnology, some of the most useful drugs were developed on the basis of human genes already known about. So erythropoietin, some of the interferons, tissue plasminogen activator, and so on. And also some of the vaccines have been based on antigens in a similar way, hepatitis B and C. Now, what happens here essentially is you're talking about a protein product which essentially is made as a medicine, but of course they're based on human gene sequences. And what has happened is that those, mostly companies involved, but not all, sometimes they're universities too, have claimed the gene sequences very much as a chemical intermediate. So we have some quite strong patents that have been awarded. But we took the view that it was in the public interest that medicines should be allowed to be developed in such a way that companies would actually invest in the very long-term development, and that product patents should be allowed on patented DNA sequences, provided that they were narrowly defined, because of course genes, it's clear these days, make more than one kind of protein. Now, one aspect that has, I think, been particularly controversial in the whole area of patenting genes has been this question of the broad scope that's allowed. So if you, for example, identify a gene and find it's got an association with a disease, and then decide that that might be useful as a diagnostic, you will have all rights to further uses down the line. So if further uses, for example, medicinal uses or other kinds of uses, say for gene therapy, are developed, you get extensive rights. And although this is actually quite an unpopular idea with the pharmaceutical industry, we argued, and others have also argued, that the scope of protection should be limited to what you have actually demonstrated and not give you rights to future uses which you have not yet demonstrated. Now, in fact, the French government has just passed a new law saying exactly this, and interestingly, it's actually in conflict with the directive from Brussels, so it's not going to be straightforward. So just to sum up here, what this will actually mean, this line of thinking on patenting DNA, is that patents on DNA would become the exception rather than the rule, that they would become more narrowly defined, and that these recommendations have to be aimed at those people who can actually use them. In other words, people granting or rejecting patents in patent offices, patent lawyers who are working with their clients, and courts who are arbitrating, and also policymakers who are drawing up the regulation. And there needs to be an international perspective on this. Now, in our report, what we essentially say is that innovation will be promoted in healthcare and in the development of new medicines if we take this approach, not just in patenting DNA, but more broadly as well. Now, I want to move beyond the consideration of patenting DNA, which I hope has illustrated to you, certainly on the one hand, the complexity and difficulty of trying to adjust rules that have been very well established in the whole area of chemical compounds, but also this whole question of thinking about what is a fair reward to industry who takes the risk and others who take risks, but also what is going to be in the longer term public interest, because many would argue there's been a disconnect between the two. Now, let's consider what the wider context of IP rights is. We're now in the position where many countries are adopting what essentially are global rules, which are referred to as the trade-related rights for intellectual property. And these essentially are administrated by the World Trade Organization and came out of what we call the GATT agreement, which was essentially replaced by the WTO. Now, what has happened essentially here is that many countries around the world have signed up to these global rules for IP, which we call TRIPS, and developing countries increasingly signed up to TRIPS over the last few years in exchange for the opening up of markets as they understood it, particularly in the area of textiles and particularly in the area of agriculture. And I'm sure you'll all be aware that some of these opening up promises have not actually been achieved. Moreover, what is now clear is that many of these countries were hurried into signing up to TRIPS, and it's fair to say that the US played a particular role in promoting this degree of regulation. Now, there's obviously a lot of interest and common sense in having standardization around the globe so that the same rules apply to patenting pharmaceuticals, to patenting research tools, to patenting plants, etc., and also in the case of copyright. But there is an impact inevitably on public health and both economic and technological development. These are not simple matters. And a particular concern that I think has attracted a lot of interest from NGOs and other commentators in the last 2 years has been this increase in price that's perceived in medicines that may occur as countries like India actually put patents on medicines, and also there may be a decrease in the choice of medicines that become available, because of course it's no longer going to be possible for countries like India and Brazil, once they sign up to TRIPS, to be able to copy the medicines that they do at the moment, which they're able to give to a lot of people who otherwise would not able to have them. Now, the conclusion of the CIPR report, which does not make comfortable reading on the whole for patent lawyers or the pharmaceutical industry, was that IPRs are unlikely to generate significant benefits for most developing countries, and that they are likely to impose costs, particularly in the case of medicines, which are likely to be higher priced. And the reasons for this are complex, and if you have the time, you'll find some of them in the report. But essentially, what is interesting in the case of intellectual property is that developing countries are essentially second comers in relation to IP in a world that's been shaped by countries such as ours, which are essentially first comers. And what they are being urged to do, and in many cases have agreed to do, is to adopt a complex set of rules which are more suited to advanced economies. And it's only fair to say that at a comparable stage of economic maturity, countries such as the US, Britain, Holland, Switzerland, we did not follow the stringent IP standards that we now advocate globally, and particularly for the developing countries. The US came very late to recognizing international copyright law. Switzerland didn't have patent law for a long time because they saw the value in being able to copy the inventions of others to get to a basic level of economic maturity. And essentially what we argue in the report is that we will now deny this opportunity for countries, particularly say in Africa, which don't have even a nascent pharmaceutical industry in some cases, as well as those countries in India and China which are facing severe health crises and which will not be able to produce essentially generic versions of other drugs. Now, it's quite clear that IP plays almost no role in stimulating R&D on diseases prevalent in the developing world, because we've already heard why that is. We also know that there is a weak relationship between wholesale drug prices and per capita income, so it's not as though there is a clear case for selling more expensive medicines in countries that have patent protection. Surprisingly, there isn't a straightforward relation there. And we've also seen, as a backdrop to this, that the costs of ARVs or antiretrovirals, which are used for treating HIV/AIDS patients, have fallen dramatically, and that generic prices now come down to from $10,000 to $200. Now, the introduction of patent systems around the world, which is now set to take place and in progress in many parts of Africa, for example, in Asia, likely to raise prices of drugs. Generic copies of new drugs will be prevented from 2005. And developing countries will need to provide effective compulsory licensing legislation, which many of them do not have. And we do need, as many of you will have read in the news lately, a solution for those countries that can't actually order compulsory licenses because they don't have any manufacturing capacity. And at the moment, the agreements that have been thrashed out at Doha do not address this last problem. So just to sum up here, we can see very clearly that within the next few years, there are going to be tremendous opportunities for innovation in healthcare. Many of those promises from genomics have not been translated into products either here in the north or in the south, but we can see that there are those opportunities, and we're going to see, I think, some of those coming on stream in the next 5 to 10 years. But some of these vaccines, diagnostics, drugs are going to become available for communicable diseases, particularly those that are important in the third world. And we do need to plan now how those advances can be fairly distributed, because there's no point having these new medicines unless they can be fairly distributed. And so what we've argued for, essentially, is that we need flexibility in global trade rules. Now, within TRIPS, and we make this clear in the report, there is some flexibility. There is flexibility for compulsory licensing. There should be flexibility for adopting some of the ways in which those patent rules can be applied to developing countries. But if we push them to adopt our rules without considering the very special conditions which prevail, then we really would be doing a disservice to those countries and to their populations. And just finally, to bring together the question about the patents on Gs, which goes to the heart of many of these IP questions, that here we have an exceptional situation, and we feel that we've moved too closely to protecting investment and information, and it's only in the exceptional case that this kind of so-called invention can be rewarded accordingly. Now, I've had to pack a great deal into a fairly short time, and I've had to give you a fairly superficial account of some of these points, but I hope I've tried to give you a sense of some of the controversies that are associated with some specific areas, such as patenting DNA in biomedicine, but also some of the global context that's been especially controversial, and I'll be happy to elaborate on some of those during the question and answer session. Thank you very much.
If we could have the 5 folks on the panel come forward, I'll introduce them actually all at once. I don't know about you all, but I'm totally blown
Very
away.
hard to do, actually.
Those are 2
Very hard to
terrifically clear
do.
presentations of rather intricate
2 different things.
arguments and a lot of data. And I want to do 2 apologies, one to the audience and one to the panelists. To the audience, we obviously have tried to cram a lot into a small amount of time. So the flood has only started, and that's linked to the apology to the speakers. Every one of the speakers you're going to be hearing, every one of the panelists can and does give major talks all the time, and they could have spoken for hours on the issues that they're going to be commenting on. We've asked them to keep their remarks short in order to allow the breadth of perspectives that you'll hear emerge from this panel. I will just go through, and I will not introduce them one at a time, but I'll ask you to kind of go seriatim across the table here without further wasting any more of your time after the introductions. Jerry Kirsch is the director of the Fogarty International Center. This is the part of the NIH that does international research, and I don't know whether you're still the largest funder of international research, maybe Gates, I don't know where you are relative to them, but certainly in the government sector it is the big player and the biggest at the National Institutes of Health. All other parts of it do, other parts of NIH do lots of international research. But Jerry's also part of the Varmus legacy at the National Institutes of Health. I guess there have been at least 2 golden ages of NIH, one under James Shannon and another one under Harold Varmus. And hiring Jerry Kirsch, I can tell you from many interchanges with Harold Varmus, that was one of his proudest achievements, because he actually had a real passion for international health research. It was amazing. And he really was incredibly enthusiastic about building up the international research infrastructure and using NIH kind of as a tool for world development, not just doing science, but also thinking about the uses of that science around the world. Ted Rummel is in the same office that does the technology licensing for the National Institutes of Health. He's in that business and has been doing that off and on for at least a decade, and has actually had many other jobs within the public health service, so has had the perspective of looking down on the whole public health service from the top, all these various pieces that make up the alphabet soup that makes up the Department of Health and Human Services. Claire Driscoll works in the National Center for, I'm still back in 1989, aren't I? The National Human Genome Research Institute. Tells you how old I am. And is the person who at the NHGRI is responsible for kind of paying attention to patent issues and technology transfer issues. And that institute has been taking a leadership role in setting policies that actually spill out of genomics and are beginning to be thought about in connection with studies on proteins and in other parts of biomedical research. And then we have 2 homegrown crops here. Henry Grabowski is in the Department of Economics and has been studying the pharmaceutical industry for many, many years. One of the best known figures in the world. for doing econometric studies of the pharmaceutical development process, and has recently been actually writing about the very topics that we've been talking about today. And Kevin Schulman wears multiple hats. I don't know how many it is. It's probably at least 10. But he has two major ones that are relevant today. One is he's in the medical center, and he's also at the Fuqua School, the business school, and teaches about biotechnology. And a couple of years ago, when was that conference on medicines for AIDS in South Africa?
Just a year ago.
Just a year ago. Okay, so Kevin has been engaged on this topic for quite some time, and so I'm not going to say anything more. We haven't actually prepped the panelists to tell them what to say or anything, so we actually will be surprised by what we hear here. And so Maria and Sandy, get your helmets on. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to you. And I will remind you all that at the end of this, we will have a Q&A, and we will ask those of you who have questions for Ted and Jerry to be first in line so that we can get them to their plane, because both of them have to catch planes out of here right at 7. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. I did not prepare remarks, so I'm speaking off the top of my head, listening to Maria and Sandy. I was very happy to come because when I hear Bob introduce me, I can figure out what it is that I do, and so thank you very much. And secondly, I never miss an opportunity to meet up with Maria and Sandy, so I appreciate it. I also have a connection with Duke, and the reason that I'm at NIH is because your emeritus professor of pediatrics called me up one day and said I ought to put my CV in for this job that was opening up because we could do some good things in global health. So I did, and I wound up at the NIH and met up with Maria and met Sandy subsequently, and Ted and Claire and others. The world can be divided into the world that existed before Bayh-Dole and the world that existed after Bayh-Dole. And there were some really important issues around that legislation, and it's quite interesting to not only look at the legislation itself, but to read the newspaper accounts and what was going on around the time. So there was clearly a need to use intellectual property to drive product development, and that was because government is a terrible way to do that. The public sector failed to capitalize on discovery. We had to get something that would get us past the inaction in government. So Bayh-Dole came along, and it gave to the academic sector the rights to generate intellectual property. And remember, I spent my entire career in academic medicine between Mount Sinai and Tufts in Boston. And so I'm an investigator, I'm a physician, I did infectious disease, I ran a clinical service, I ran a research service, I generated intellectual property, and I understood it as a producer. But I didn't really have a sense of what it meant other than the potential of a royalty check that would come in part to my lab and in part to my pocketbook. And I don't think I'm atypical of most of the investigators who worked in the after Bayh-Dole arena. Well, after Bayh-Dole came in, and there started to be technology transfer offices at universities and at the NIH and elsewhere. Some other things happened as well. AIDS came along. TB resurged in large part because of AIDS, and because both in this country and in the rest of the world, we had an entirely dysfunctional public health system. We had failed to make any investment over decades. And the best part about public health, when it really succeeds, nothing happens. And so no money goes into it. And very soon we were creating multi-drug resistant tuberculosis because of the gross inadequacies of the system. Malaria reappeared with a vengeance. And then a whole series of emerging infectious diseases came about. Some of them were re-emerging diseases. And it's only 10 years ago that the Institute of Medicine published a report on emerging infectious diseases, and only, today's Wednesday, only yesterday that the second generation of this report was released by the Institute of Medicine. So there's a lot that's happened in the 23 years now since Bayh-Dole. There are lots of divisions that one could talk about. One of the divisions that's created is when you look at research and the generation of intellectual property and access, there's, as Maria showed in her slide, there was a big gulf between the initial discovery and ultimately the access issues. But access is typically presented in the activist frame, in the activist voice, and it's typically confrontational. And confrontational has its virtues, but it also, I think, has some problems associated with it in actually getting things done. So Maria talked about an alliance, and I think that that's extremely important, the use of that term of an alliance of strange bedfellows in many ways, and few other than Maria Freire could create that kind of an alliance. We talked, there was a little bit about what the NIH is, and in a sense, NIH is truly the largest biomedical university. It's very atypical for government in the way it works, in the way it sees itself, in the way it behaves. And we get away with it because we say we do research and other parts of the department make policy. It's also unique in the sense that it's I think, the only National Medical Research Council kind of an organization that actually will fund research anywhere in the world. The British, the UK MRC does not really fund internationally in the way that the NIH does. So there's a lot of potential in the NIH to address some of the issues that have been brought up by both Maria and Sandy. Now, I wish that the Fogarty International Center had the characteristics that Bob attributed to it. What's interesting is John Fogarty, who is a Democratic representative from Rhode Island, in 1958 introduced a bill into the House that would have created a National Institute of International Health Research, and in 1958 dollars put $50 million into it. If that had happened and the growth of that institute had been parallel with the rest of the institutes at the NIH, of the $27 billion, we would have a huge investment in global health. And he said we should do it because we really care. And we need to demonstrate that we really care about the health of the world. This is in 1958. It's quite remarkable. This is the 35th anniversary of the founding of the center, so we're doing all of this historical context and trying to understand where it came from. But it took until 2001 for the Fogarty Center to have a budget of $50 million. And what do we do with that? We've been investing it in a way that's trying to bridge the gaps between the first and the third world. And we've done it in part by selecting particular research areas in which we can fund or co-fund or stimulate. But we've also done it by trying to stimulate the capacity to do appropriate research in developing countries. So investing in developing countries through training. And we do that through the academic institutions in the United States and in Canada and in South Africa and in multiplicity of places. So we've invested in science. We've invested in trying to train in intellectual property and to create the same kind of an understanding of what intellectual property is and how it could be used in the developing world as we have here. We are trying to build capacity in ethics. You can't deal in research in developing countries without simultaneously investing in ethics. And we've tried to invest in genetics. This is the 21st century, when the last time I looked. And the revolution in medicine, however long it takes, is going to be in significant part, through genetics. We're trying to create alliances between academia and government. And we're trying to make this alliance go from the basic discovery end through the translation of research, which involves clinical research as well. And that's where a lot of the cost for industry really comes in, supporting the large clinical trials that are necessary. In some instances, we absolutely need to do those in developing countries. You can't study malaria drugs or malaria vaccines here. But there's a couple of hundred people who developed malaria from travel. And we actually had a couple of cases of mosquito-transmitted malaria around Washington, D.C. last year. You can't study mother-to-child transmission of HIV in this country because 10 years ago we showed that AZT actually works. And so you can't test a new drug because we've virtually eliminated the problem. You have to go to the developing world. How do you do it in an ethical context where it's relevant to what they need and it achieves something for us as well? Did you say a win-win situation? I think we need to be creating that. And one of the important things that we need to do, and I probably should wind up to watch the clock here, and we actually pay a lot of attention to it, is to try to create a global culture of science. Now, Harold Varmus has been talking about a global culture of science, and I think we really need to think about what that means. An academic institution needs to think about what that means. Jonas Salk was asked why didn't he patent the vaccine, the polio vaccine? And his answer was, would you patent the sun? That was the culture of science at that time. That was the culture of science when I grew up in science and medicine. In fact, we talked about medicine as a profession. Now you talk about it as a job, and you look at it, what's the benefits, how much vacation time do I get, how many secretaries, and so on. So the culture has really changed, and what's happened in the university setting, in direct consequence of Bayh-Dole, is that the universities have changed from being a generator of knowledge and a disseminator of knowledge to being a generator of intellectual property and looking at the royalty streams that come from it. And that's been a real shift in the culture of the universities. And I think we need to come back to what the culture is in the universities as much as we need to think about what the culture is in government in making these partnerships. One last comment. The term neglected diseases came up. And tuberculosis is sort of a neglected disease. We've paid some attention to the immunology. We've learned a lot of things, and we really don't understand how it works in spite of that. But there's been ongoing research because it's interesting immunologically. I think we need to think not only of neglected diseases, but neglected populations. And those neglected populations are not just in the third world. They're here in a country as rich as the United States. And what's the link? The link is poverty. We do not deal well with poverty, whether it's poverty in the developing world or poverty here. So I'm not sure I've explained what we're trying to do, but we are trying to look at specific issues, trying to think about how we can promote this globalization, the good side of globalization, and make these linkages and try to do some good.
Ted, come on. All right. Good evening to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Wanted to give you a little bit of a background as to our organization. Where the OSSA Technology Transfer for the National Institutes of Health. We also handle technology transfer for the Food and Drug Administration, and we have a dual function. One is that we are the administrators of inventions that come through, and we help to identify that, protect it, market it, and license it. We also then monitor it, and we collect royalties. But another function that we have is in the area of policy, and the Secretary of the Department has designated our office as the lead for technology transfer policy for the Department of Health and Human Services, which gets us involved with a number of issues. It takes us far beyond the R&D base that most people would think of the NIH. And some of those areas get us involved in what are essential drugs, how do we get drugs to third world countries in the developing world, and how can we help develop an infrastructure in the third world. We sit on U.S. trade representative committees, and you may recall back when in the times with problems in South Africa, there was an agreement between Secretary Shalala and Ambassador Barshevsky that on determinations of trade issues that there should be people from the health area to sit on that. There are two people that sit on the 301 sanctions group for the USTR. I'm one of those people. I represent the NIH. And we also sit on another group for the USTR. That's to give you an idea that we get involved with a lot of major policy issues on behalf of the Secretary, intergovernmental and international issues. So let me start from that base, and I'll try and make some comments. And Bob, you understated this. This is a whole semester course that you've laid out here. Maria and Sandy have laid out so many items. You've covered, I mean, from appetizer through dessert in this, and it's very, very difficult to really make comments on many of the things that are here. But I'm going to give a try to cover a number of them and to tell you some of the things that are going on at the NIH. And also, my colleague here, Jerry, did not talk about some of the, I think, innovative programs that he has that we've been working together on in developing capacities in developing countries. And he has a program to do that, and we work hand in glove with his organization, because if you're developing a research component in a developing country, it's a natural add-on for the infrastructure of how do you move technology out from the research lab to make it something of value to patients, especially in the biomedical area. And so we're working in that particular area and helping to develop infrastructures. And we're working around the world. We've gone to a number of developing countries, and we are developing a capacity internally now that we'll be having an ongoing relationship with many of these developing countries to help them to develop their scientific base, as Jerry is doing, and to move those technologies forward. So that is an important step. We are true believers, I think, that developing countries have the capacity to help themselves and to work on those kinds of issues that are endemic. There are very bright people, there are very capable people in many countries around the world, and they need some support. Jerry gives them some support. He also trains some people and gives them support to go back to their countries, and hopefully we can help them to move those discoveries forward. But let me give you an example. Last year I put on a lot of miles going to a lot of places around the world, and I'll give you a little case study of what I saw in Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia, you may say, well, is that a developing country or not? It probably is. Most people consider it that. It does have some very well-trained physicians that are there, mostly from the United States and the UK, where they receive their training. They brought to my attention something that they had done, and that was they had a problem there. Every year when the Hajj came in, they would have problems with the spread of meningitis, a certain type of meningitis, and it created tremendous problems for them. They could not get anybody really to work on that particular problem. So what they did is they set about trying to determine how they could be identifying people who would be carrying this particular disease. It so happens that they entered into a partnership, of all places, the University of Nebraska. And there's a long history as to why Nebraska and Saudi Arabia work together, but they do. And what happened is that the Saudi physicians came up with what they felt was a diagnostic for this type of meningitis. And the University of Nebraska technology transfer people worked with them to develop that. They have developed a kit that they use in Saudi Arabia, and this year when the Hajj came, they went and they tested people that came through with their own test kit, dealing with a disease in their own country that they couldn't get other people to deal with. Maybe simplistic, but it's a good, I think, case study of how a developing country with a scientific base, with some assistance, can work on those problems in their own country and not have to rely on the developing world to come in and do it for them. There are a couple of things that Maria said that I think are extremely important, and that is the deal structure. Jerry and I were at a meeting at Yale dealing with a number of people on AIDS issues and access to AIDS drugs. And the whole focus was on patenting. And I kept saying, what is the issue? What's the issue? All the issues that were brought up were not patent issues. They were licensing issues. How are these things being licensed? Sandy talked about Myriad. Myriad, it's not the patent that's the issue, it's how Myriad was implementing their patent, which is all tests be done by Myriad. We're not going to license that technology out to someone else. But the key thing is here, how does one structure a particular deal? And I think that's where we really have to focus on and spend more time is taking a look at licensing structure, the terms of licenses. As Maria said, she's able to get something working because she's able to work out the licensing deals, even with multiple IP patents on it. I mentioned about the infrastructure activities that we're working on. A very important concept is that government, industry, and academia, whether it's here or in developing countries, need to talk with one another. They not necessarily need to partner together in all cases because they may not be on the same wavelength. But they have to understand what the needs are of each group. And at some point in time, hopefully those groups will cross-fertilize. And in some developing countries, that's occurring already. One of the interesting things that came out of our meeting at Yale was that's very interesting, that developing countries are not interested in a patenting system until they have something to protect. Once they develop something, all of a sudden they are first in line to say, we need a patent system to protect this. So one needs to take a look at this and put it into context of the various reports, et cetera, as to what you're talking about, where is this country in development, what are they looking for, and what kind of an patent system would be of assistance to them. Let me see if I can cover a couple of other things. In the area of research tools, the NIH did come out with a report and guidelines on research tools. In fiscal year 2000, the Senate changed Bayh-Dole, and probably many of you did not know Bayh-Dole ever got changed, but it did in 2000 for a change. And the change was that it specified the objectives of Bayh-Dole, and then they added, without adversely impacting future research and development. That was geared primarily to support what the research tool guidelines were, which are saying we need to share research tools reasonably with one another, that reach through kinds of responsibility, reach through terms and licenses were really inappropriate. And the NIH really is involved with that because one of the things we have in our mission is really to ensure that there is a continuing global, robust research enterprise. Because without the research enterprise moving along in a robust manner, I'm not sure that we're going to be developing these new drugs and new cures in the future. So we need to make sure that the research enterprise is kept robust. The research tool guidelines seem to be taking effect. I was just at the autumn meeting this past year in which it was reported to me the autumn did a study, and overwhelmingly institutions are saying that the NIH guidelines have had a significant effect on their ability to transfer between nonprofit institutions and also between institutions and companies. And what was really significant is that they're reporting that it has had a positive impact on companies sharing with institutions. And the primary reason for that, I believe, is that the institutions now have a base. They say, here are the ground rules for how we're going to deal. In the past, what they would do is they would go and they would say, Harvard signed it, why doesn't Duke? And I'm sure many of you that are involved with tech transfer hear that all the time. And what's happened is now a floor has been established where most of the institutions have bought into this. The University of California has made it institutional policy. Perhaps Duke should make it institutional policy. To have, that is it. That's the way we're going to operate, period. So that's an important aspect I think needs to be looked at also. Let me see. So many things. Let me just say one last comment I want to make, and that was Sandy mentioned about the research exemption. We've looked very hard at the research, foreign research exemption. You folks probably here at Duke are painfully aware of searching for a research exemption. There has been proposed legislation on research exemptions. None of that has worked because it's fatally flawed. What was mentioned about in Europe, that in France, Germany have a research exemption. Well, that may work now, but when you read the definition, it says you can use it, but it cannot be used for commercial purposes. So as nonprofit institutions in Europe get more into the mainstream that they're modeling after the U.S. model, you're going to find that some of those people are going to run up against the same problem in that they don't have a research exemption that they thought they had. So those are just some comments, and I'd like to open it up, or we move on, Bob, whatever.
Yeah.
Do you want to do questions for the two of them before they leave, or?
I don't want to cover things that maybe
Maybe
others.
we should. Why don't we see if there are some specific questions and give folks a few minutes, because you all are going to have to head out of here in 15 minutes. Are there any questions specific to Senator? Yes.
I'd just be interested in a kind of big picture for both Jerry and Ted. How do you compare to what the World Health Organization does in terms of your budget and your presence in sort of international organizational efforts to solve these big picture problems about IP, about infrastructure, about taking on difficult diseases and difficult populations in terms of the money that they have to bring to bear on these problems?
Well, I think the first big difference is that WHO doesn't have any money. Its budget is, in fact, fixed, not in relation to the global economy, but in actual dollars. And so it's a difficult circumstance for WHO to operate under those circumstances. It also is not a science agency. It's a political agency that represents 191 countries, and that makes it very different in its orientation. But it's complementary. The common goal, I think, is in improving health. The mission of the NIH, if you go on the webpage, the mission of the NIH is to advance knowledge to improve the health of everyone. So even though we're a national institution, the everyone is in fact all inclusive, and there's always been this outward concern for the rest of the world. But the driver of research and the driver of knowledge is not what WHO does. WHO has reach into the countries and is very important in representing the voice of those 191 countries, and in particular the low and lower middle income countries who otherwise do not have a voice. So we should be able to work in a complementary manner, and to some extent we do. I think we do much better with the regional organization of WHO, is the Pan American Health Organization. In fact, it's older than WHO. It just celebrated its 100th year, and it's quite effective. If you measure productivity and bureaucracy ratio, PAHO comes up much higher than WHO does. I'm not sure if that addresses it, but I think that there's lots of places where we can work collaboratively. The WHO report on genomics and global health was mentioned, and that's a very important report. It took 2 years to put together. There was a lot of massaging of it, and in that 2 years, while that report was being massaged and has a bunch of recommendations, we went ahead and funded a program that's building research capacity in genomics and post-genomics research in low and middle income countries. And it's sort of a difference in the way we can act and what WHO does. But they fit together. That provided a framework. Okay?
Ted, I had a question for you, or just ask you to elicit one thing. You were, I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit. One of the things that NIH can do is kind of set trends because you have a policy-making capacity. And I wondered if you could float just one or two examples of licensing things that you have done that address some of these issues, because I know you have some examples.
The NIH has been trying over the past few years to come up with some what we call innovative terms of our particular licenses that would encourage companies to work with developing countries and to ensure that developing countries have access to any products that may come out of a particular technology. We have developed some language. We have it in several of our licenses. It's too early to tell how well that's going to work because they're still at the very early stages. We did have one particular example when Maria was there, and that dealt with a company called Medichem Pharmaceuticals that entered into a relationship with Sarawak. And actually, this was dealing with a product that came out of that country, and they entered into a joint, I guess you can call it a joint company, a new joint company, in which the Sarawak owns, I think, 50% of the company, and they will be developing and hopefully will have a product which they will then manufacture and distribute, in which the people of that country will have a part to play, and the manufacturing facilities are going to be there. That's an example of something that has occurred from one of our technologies. I do have some of some terms of some of the licenses. Just give you an idea that the licensee, 6 months after they have put in their NDA or get their approval, have to detail to us how they're going to work with the public sector in developing countries. And developing countries are used that $1,000 or less of income, per capita income. And they'd have to present us with a commercialization plan with benchmarks and milestones that fit the requirements of the license, that they either ensure, using their own resources, that there are allocations of the particular product in the developing country, or that they develop a relationship with a third party in that country in order to ensure the manufacture and sale of the product in that country. So here's an innovative kind of term that we put in our license. Jerry held a conference about 3 or 4 months ago in which he was encouraging universities to take a look at this, see if they could come up with some innovative terms to their particular licenses. Because again, I'm talking about licenses, not patents. And I think too many people get stuck on the patents, and I don't mean to offend patent lawyers in the audience, but that's their thing and they like to deal with it. But I think it's the licenses that are really a key aspect of this. So we think some of these things are going to work, and I have to give some credit. Maria last year at the autumn meeting was very provocative, in which she received an award from Autumn, and then came out and challenged basically the university community to think about putting terms into the licenses that they enter into to ensure that developing countries will receive adequate amounts of any product, and also helping to build some kind of an infrastructure. So we've been working on this for a long time. Our thoughts have been there. When Bob says we're on the cutting edge, we probably are compared to many other institutions. And I have to say I've been lucky to work with some very, very wonderful people, including Maria. And she didn't pay me to say that.
Yeah.
Especially.
No, he just had to put up with me.
That's right.
Should I tell
Maybe
them?
we should
When
move on.
Maria left, Maria is a whirlwind. I mean, she's just unbelievable. That we actually, when she left, we had little pins that said, I survived, what was it, 6
years.
years, 7 months, and 11 days with Maria Frere. It was a wonderful time, and it's still probably one of the most exciting jobs I've ever had is working where I am.
Thank you. I think maybe we should move on to Claire and, or Kevin, go ahead.
Just one quick question. How much license revenue does NIH get a year?
NIH does get some revenue. This past year was $51 million. We represent 70% of the royalty income from the entire federal government, all their laboratories combined. So you include DOD, Energy, NASA, et cetera. We represent 70% of that. Comparing us to universities, and universities they're not just biomedical, they include other things. Probably we're placed at about 5th highest in income from income generating. And that income is shared with inventors up to $150,000 a year, no matter how many inventions they have. And the rest goes back into further research activities. I just want to say we've had 38 inventors that have hit the cap of 158,000.
But I think we could also have gotten a lot more royalties. If you look at 50 million, that came from about $3 billion worth of funding, the intramural program. So if you look at, we probably could have gotten 100 million, 200 million. The whole point is we're not bottom line oriented, so the deals are done in a fair manner. So I think 50 million is a conservative in the manner in which we license.
Right.
And it's not a huge amount when you look at our budget, but again, we're looking for deals that are fair and that are the kind of deals that set an example.
It's an important point, is that we do make it a point to say we have a mission, and everything we do is funneled into that particular mission. Our particular mission happens to be to conduct and support research and to disseminate information to improve the public health. We don't have, as perhaps some of the institutions now in the UK unfortunately have, that one of their purposes is economic development, which is going to create, I think, some issues for them as to what metrics they're going to follow and create some real problems for them. Are they going to go economic development? Are they going to go public benefit? And who's counting the beans?
Yeah, our metrics look, if you compare our
Thank you
metrics.
both, and we'll when you guys need to disappear, go ahead and feel free to do that.
Claire can amply.
Answer questions. Well, I think it's interesting, the Association of University Technology Managers comes out with a survey every year. If you look at the metrics on universities, $1 per $1 million of research, how many patents do you get, how many invention reports, how many companies get spun out, people are always, the universities are always, trying to move up on the list and be more efficient and be better. Whereas the NIH, our metrics are terrible if you do that kind of stat. The number of invention reports per $1 million of a number of companies. We're terrible, but we're not looking at that. But most universities are now focused on that. So it kind of changes the whole perspective from an enterprise, they're more enterprise-oriented and we're more service-oriented. So it's something that we're telling the universities to think about, but we realize they have a different mission than the NIH. So we can't be too altruistic in what we say. I just had a couple of points. I represent the National Human Genome Research Institute at NIH. So most of you know us as the funder of the Human Genome Project, which is actually finishing up. Other than that announcement 2 years ago, we're really going to finish this April to coincide with the 50th anniversary of the discovery of the structure of DNA by Watson and Crick in 1953. So it's good timing. But in addition to funding the Human Genome Project, we also, from the very beginning of that project, have put aside 5% of the money every year into what we call our ELSI program, or Ethical, Legal, and Social Implications of the Human Genome Project. So I think that's important for people to know. We've been looking at these patent issues, licensing issues for genomics inventions for many years, and we funded other people to do so. And that's important. In fact, Bob has a grant from the Genome Institute to look at DNA-based patents, and more importantly, DNA-based patents, how they're licensed at Canadian and U.S. academic institutions. And so what I think is you'll see is everyone talks about the Myriad Genetics story and BRCA1, but that's kind of like the only story you hear about. I mean, that's the anecdotal story. So what we're trying to do is get some real empirical data. is there really abuse going on of gene patents? In particular, is the licensing really problematic? What are the stats? Are these stories just exceptions, or are they the norm? And so we're trying to fund some rigorous studies in that area so that that can inform the policy debate. And there really isn't a lot of data out there on the use of these sort of inventions and how these things get commercialized, whether or not the system's working. So I think that's important to keep in mind. I'm kind of the person that's in the trenches, and so I'll just make a couple points. I'll give one example of some policies that we've been working on in collaboration with the Office of Tech Transfer and Ted Rummel's office. We have an interest in making sure that DNA-based diagnostics are affordable and accessible, mostly in the U.S., but also could be in terms of global. And so what we've done is we've come up with some stipulations for how we handle that. We're hoping this becomes a model it'll be a model for all of NIH. It's how we really do things, but also that it'll be used in the academic sector. And hopefully, just like the research tools policy or other policies, it might actually be adopted by people that aren't federal grantees and that really have no reason that they have to follow these policies. But what we've seen is once the NIH puts out an important new policy, whether it's data sharing or research tools, or in this case, the policy is having to do with licensing of genomic inventions, we find a lot of the community, if they think it makes sense and it seems to work, you get a lot more adoption of it across the board. So that's what we're looking at, and beyond just grantees. So the whole idea for at least the case of diagnostics would be to execute primarily non-exclusive licenses. We'd be supportive perhaps of even some legislative fixes such as compulsory licensing of diagnostic uses for gene patents. However, we recognize how difficult that would be to get a legislative change. So a policy or some guidelines is a good first step, but that's one road we can go down. We also encourage the use of limited fields of use and mandatory sub-licensing provisions whenever we do exclusives. Generally, we don't do exclusive licenses for diagnostics. That just flies in the face of everything we're trying to do, which is to foster all sorts of spin-off developments from the basic technology. And we're also developing a best practices guidance for use by grantees and hopefully the larger community. And we're going to make sure that those licenses also include provisions for ensuring continuing availability of the invention for research use. These are things that the NIH has been doing all along. We've been doing this for many years, but we've never written down a lot of this. We've never put it into a policy and told our grantees, you know what, for genomic inventions in particular, we really want you to pay attention to this. So that's some things we're working on, and I think for the sake of time, I'll stop there.
Okay. I think we've had two provocative talks, and I'm trying to edit my remarks. I want to give some perspective from the standpoint of economics. It's often characterized as a dismal science, but since I've been studying innovation and technology, I tend to be an optimist. Basically, I concur with most of the talks and the papers and reports that they're based on. I just want to underscore a few points. First, with respect to Sandy's paper and the Nuffield Council report, I think the broad messages there are that patents issued with respect to DNA sequences should be rare. Where they exist, they should be narrow in scope, and the criteria of inventiveness and utility should be applied stringently by patent authorities. And I think there's a basis in economic theory to support most of those statements. Essentially, there's a public good aspect to the knowledge from the genome. We want to encourage a lot of research avenues. We want to let 1,000 flowers bloom. And if we had very broad claims, then you could stymie important lines of research or erect higher cost and risk. And you get into toll gate problems and royalty stacking and bargaining problems that Rebecca Eisenberg and others that have written about. And so along the same lines, I think research exemption is an important policy that we should really give a high priority to. Right now, we don't have that, and I think it's important not only in this area, but more broadly for scientific research. There is some precedent in U.S. law that for giving a research exemption, in the case of the Hatch-Waxman Act, Congress gave a research exemption to generic firms to do their bioequivalence testing prior to patent expiration so that they could get on the market as soon as a patent expires, that they could get a provisional approval. Prior to this law, courts had ruled that it would infringe the innovator's patent rights to even do the testing, so that you'd have to wait till the patent ran out to even begin to do the testing to show your product was equivalent. And so Congress decided it was in the public interest that we get the generics as fast as possible. And in the same way, I think we could determine it's in the public interest to have a research exemption for where the research is not commercially oriented. Now, what happens if you then get a product that comes out that depends on this technology that you used in your research? Well, then I think you have to have a negotiation process. You have to have some kind of a reach-through royalty arrangement. And you may even need to think about dispute resolution settlements, because we don't want to get to the point of having infringing a product just as it's about to go onto the market. So we may need some arbitration processes. There's no perfect solutions usually in IP, so you have to think about what compromises you can make here. I was very happy that the report, while it limited or constrained, wants to make reforms with regard to gene patents, it reaffirms the basic importance of the patent system, particularly in pharmaceuticals. And I think that's important because coming to more academic type conferences where people say, we got to get rid of this patent system, we got to go to compulsory licensing, even in countries like the US and the UK. Some people at the very radical say, we really should give this all to the government to do, and then we could have these drugs very cheaply. But I don't think the people that don't understand the economics of the pharmaceutical industry who make those statements, that basically drug development is a very costly, risky process. We have Joe DeMasi, Ron Hansen and I have an article in the current Journal of Health Economics this month that tracks the R&D cost of a portfolio of drugs in the 90s. We come out with a number of $400 million for out-of-pocket cost and roughly double that for capitalized cost. And I could go into, because of the hour, I'm not going to go into why that's so, but it relates to, even in clinical testing, most drugs fail, and they can fail because of safety, because of efficacy, because of economics, because of manufacturing difficulties, and so forth. And so there's a long, costly process of a decade or more. But once you get a drug on the market, the cost of imitation are very low. The imitation is just showing bioequivalence. That's $1 million kind of enterprise rather than several $100 million. And both innovators and imitators play a useful role. And so you need a balance here. But without something like a patent system, you wouldn't even have a generic industry after a while. There wouldn't be any research in new products. I think that's an important premise that's been retained by both speakers. Now, in terms of the Global Alliance report, I think historically there's been, as Maria pointed out, patents can prevent easy imitation, but they don't ensure that products will come forth where there aren't market incentives, that companies won't bear these high costs and risks. Two areas that this has been a social welfare problem are drugs for rare diseases, so-called orphan drugs, and drugs for third world diseases, where it's not that the patient population is small, but the ability to pay is limited. Pharmaceutical firms have made contributions in particular areas in donation programs, like with river blindness and leprosy and other diseases. But the problem is much too broad, given that they have a responsibility to shareholders to expect donation programs to solve this problem. So I think the Global Alliance is a really very welcome development, both as a potential source of new drugs, but also as a model for other organizations and diseases. And I think what's some of the noteworthy features are the leveraging of public and private contributions through risk sharing, a portfolio approach to the goals, so that several projects, it's not just betting on one project, but there'll be a multi-stage process, just like a pharmaceutical firm would approach it, so that there's a probability by the year 2010 that we will have important new drugs. A fast-track approach to development, which is very much in the spirit of orphan drug approvals in the U.S., so that you could get an approval in principle on one pivotal trial in an accelerated fast track. And the cost would not be trivial, but they would be not nearly as big as the 400 or 800 million that I was referring to, that RTI did a study that I was an advisor to, and the cost range we were talking about was 115 to 240 million dollars. I think the program has a lot of similarities and some important differences to the Orphan Drug Act, which has been a big success. We've had an Orphan Drug Act in the U.S. since 1983. We've now had 2 decades. People were skeptical that you could get a lot of research on orphan drugs, but 2 decades later, we've seen lots of new drug introductions for orphan indications, and we've seen mortality from rare diseases significantly falling. And I think the Orphan Drug Act embodied cost sharing through R&D credits. It embodied fast-track regulatory approval and some special orphan drug market exclusivities. And I think the Global Alliance has some of the same premises, but also has things like IPR as a strategic tool with, which is a unique part of the experiment that I think is really worth watching. And so therefore, I think this is a really interesting experiment that hopefully when we look back, as we have had with 20 years with the Orphan Drug Act, we'll see a lot of successes.
You always put me between you guys and dinner. Actually, there are a couple of different things that struck me tonight, and I'll start on the IP issues. And we had a meeting yesterday with a researcher at Duke who thinks he could predict who's going to get recurrence of breast cancer based on actually most of the gene patent applications were wrong. It's not one gene or another. It's how much of that one gene is being expressed in relationship to a whole bunch of others. And if you see these really bizarre graphics, you look at panels of genes. They look at 50, 100, 200, whether or not they're on or off. And they were all excited. They think they can nail this. So I asked them a couple simple questions, like, have you looked to see whether or not someone's patented all the genes that are in your test? And they said, what are you talking about? And then I said, well, you can't use their patents. And they said, well, what about this research? We're just doing research to try and figure out if what people thought 3 years ago at the Human Genome Project is right, or whether we're right now. And Duke, as was alluded to before, is up and trying to get to the Supreme Court to say that there's an ability to use patents for research purposes. And the research use that the appeals court case said is basically this is research is philosophical inquiry of no commercial value. And there's no philosophers on that side of campus, I promise you. It's potentially a case that we had a panel a couple months ago with Affymetrix, who actually is interested in this technology as well, where they were really arguing that we don't understand even the science or the use of these technologies, and we've allowed patents now that potentially are going to tremendously interfere with our ability to understand what the science means. And especially if anything that they're talking about right now, and there's a similar paper in New England Journal in December talking about these gene array issues, that we've potentially set ourselves up in a really serious case where the first $1 million of your grant is going to be figure out who's got the patents on the genes you want to work before you could touch anything. So that's kind of interesting. So I think I don't disagree at all with Henry. I think getting a product to, products are what we need. Patients don't benefit from science without products. Where you start patenting in order to create a product, I don't think has been proven. It's not all that clear to me that patenting the genes themselves is where you want to start. And if I want to get products, I might have to start a little bit further down the road. Which kind of brings up, so that's one thing. The second thing is the reason I kind of threw Ted an easy punch. I want to see how much NIH was revenue, and I'm going to make an argument that it's actually fairly priced. $51 million in return for $3 billion worth of basic science research is fairly priced because it's worthless. There's no drugs that come out of that. There's no market that comes out of that. This is all early stage stuff. So and the same thing with Duke. Duke argues day in and day out, every single patent they have is important. Every single patent they have is worthless. The chance of you actually commercializing something out of any individual patent is so low, it's not the same as getting hit by lightning walking down this room tonight, but you're in the ballpark. So the fact that people think that these things are important and valuable was really a big seller in how genomics was presented to Wall Street in the year 2000. We saw a huge blip in terms of money raised. It came back down again when people figured out it was worthless. If we just admit it's worthless, it'll be easier to have these conversations. And I know it's not going to make as much fun to be the tech transfer officer, but that's probably not the reason why, from the research side, I don't want to spend my day in the legal office. I'd rather do the research. On entirely flip side, I think Maria is talking about doing something that's never been done before. And saying that you're creating an organization to treat a disease or treat a drug has never been done. I mean, you start with science and you think your drug's going to work for something, but then it turns out to be Viagra, and it doesn't work for hypertension. It works out for some other disease entirely. And the chance of you saying, here's where I want to be, and being so narrowly focused, and starting with small molecules, I mean, it's incredibly ambitious. But the important thing here, which you alluded to a little bit, is what does the curve look like of if that really is your goal, and it's important for us to have that goal, how many things have to come in the pipeline in the beginning? And if you look at big cap pharma, you start with numbers like 2,500, 5,000, 10,000 leads to get a drug. And the problem is we've never admitted that on the public side. So if this is our public health imperative, that's the kind of order of magnitude. We can't do it with 4, and you can't do it with 6, and we're talking about orders of magnitude increases. And it's not to say that what you're not doing isn't incredibly elegant and ambitious, but that's not, the chance of any one of those compounds from the preclinical or even phase 1 making it to market is less than 20%. From preclinical, you're talking much, much smaller numbers. You're talking about 1s in 250, 1 in 500, maybe 1 in 1,000. So if we want to gear up for this on the public side or the public-private partnership side, we have to start with the right math. And this is uncertainty, it's risky, it's going to fail. Almost everything's going to fail. And at the end of all those failures, one thing will come out of the pipeline if we have our math right. BMS right now is, BMS Pfizer is putting $4 billion a year into their pipeline. They're getting nothing out. So why a public-private partnership putting in a smaller number of more focused molecules is going to be better? There's some advantages because biotech companies can bring things out. So maybe small organizations are better. But the idea is to be honest about the math and actually get people committed to not the $30 million. There's no way you're going to get a drug for $30 million, except if you're really lucky. And hopefully you will be, if that, the malaria initiative or whatever it is. Here's a small pot of money. It's not that. I mean, we're not going to take all the money Bill has. Actually, it might require that to get 3 drugs to market. What? Not enough. My stock's way down. But I think we haven't seen good math, taking the same math we use on the commercial R&D side or the financial NSUs and bring that to the public markets and say, look, world, if you're really serious about doing this, we might be lucky, but let's not plan on being lucky, let's plan on being right. And this is what you'd have to take to get something out of the pipeline at the end. And I think, having that math out there and having people focused on that, on the uncertainties and tolerating failure. I mean, most grant funding programs don't tolerate failure. NIH doesn't tolerate failure all that well either. But failure is an intrinsic part of what the R&D process is, and I think we need to be honest about that, which makes it harder and harder to attract these funds. But why don't I just leave it there?
Can I respond to that?
Yeah, I was just,
No, I think you're absolutely right.
come on. Yeah.
People would shoot us.
Well, that was the idea.
I don't need any more enemies out there. I think the math issue is a very important issue. And in fact, when you look at what the math is and the number of compounds, it isn't really one lead compound. You're talking about everything that they put through screens. And when you do that analysis, and we've done that analysis, and to give you a sense of comfort, we actually do have numbers, attrition rates. And so we've done the entire mapping. Because you're absolutely right, the chances of getting hit by lightning are a lot higher than getting these compounds. So just to give you a sense of comfort that we actually have that, both the simulation and the strategy to address that.
If at the end of the day, it takes 200 million or 400 million in out-of-pocket, how do you get that money?
Well, we have our plan is for $400 million in funding. We know that's going to take that much.
I wanted to make a comment on the fear of, that I think is unrealistic, that all of a sudden all these companies are going to enforce their patents on academic researchers. I mean, it just hasn't happened. It doesn't mean that we should all relax, as we know from the court decision recently. There is no real research exemption, but even if there were one, I mean, the academics, most of them, at least the ones at NIH and the people we're funding, are not doing purely non-commercial research anyway. So, but it seems like, you know, the biotech companies and the pharmaceutical companies have better things to do than to sue for infringement of basic researchers. So I don't think that's a huge fear. But, you know, as those researchers become more clinically oriented or move down, that could be a problem. And the second, I just want to point out that the NIH and other organizations, we're doing a lot of what I call preemptive strikes, certainly in the area of genomics. We put the human genome sequence out there in the public domain. We did the SNP consortium. We have a haplotype map project. We have the human gene collection where every single human gene clone is available at cost. And so we put all these things out there, and that means what? People can't patent it then. If all this basic information, genetic information in databases or basic research tools that people need to do the research, if we get that all in the public domain out there, then it's a preemptive strike against those who want to patent it. So we've been doing a lot of these projects. Many times the impetus for the project is it's needed in the community, but more importantly, we want to get there first so the commercial entity doesn't get there ahead of us.
So just since everybody's hesitating a little bit, I'll ask at least one question. In connection with that last point, have you thought about one of the things under Bayh-Dole is that it is hard for you in advance to determine this is the kind of thing that we actually think it would be better if we were dumping these data quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Now you've taken action despite that limitation,
Mm-hmm.
but would it be helpful to have that built into the law so that there's not quite as high a hurdle that you have to climb over?
It would be
I know they have
great,
that
but the
in
universities will scream and yell. You can't, it's like the third rail, you know, touching Social Security. If you're a politician, you can't touch Bayh-Dole if you're at NIH. So yeah, I mean, we use this awkward mechanism called a declaration of exceptional circumstances, which means you don't get Bayh-Dole rights. We want it in the public domain. We use it when we have to, but it's very cumbersome. And it would be nice, because really, if we explain the projects, most of the academic researchers say, yeah, of course we don't want, but the whole point of that is to make it a resource available to the community, such as mutant mice models or clones or arrays or tissue microarrays. I mean, that just, everyone would agree, but yet the administrators and the tech transfer offices and those organizations don't want to even talk about modifying Bayh-Dole. So it's an issue.
Jerry?
Well, three challenging or provocative comments, but I regret that I couldn't get here in time to hear the main pages, so what maybe got sleep. One thinking about Kevin's problems about how do we use these genes to make this fantastic gene advance if they're patented. Well, I mean, NIH has margin rights under Bayh-Dole, and that's colossally willing to use them for university research of the kind Kevin is telling us, then they have that authority already. They don't have to go back to Congress. They just got to get on their backsides and do it. So I think we need to think about that. I'm
Yeah.
being deliberately provocative. Secondly, on Henry's point, and there's some confusion, and I hope that we're going to clarify this, between the extreme of compulsorily licensing everything and the possibility of more creative use of liability rules, which would give clear entitlements, but not necessarily the power to exclude. And Tracy and I'm throwing down a gauntlet because Tracy Lewis and I are working hard on this, and I think we can come up with something that. Part of the problem is that you're using the patent system, as some of the judges on the Court of Appeals of the Federal Circuit are now openly admitting, I think, not wisely, as investment protection rather than invention promotion. So your standards are going down. While you're saying we need stiff standards, all the standards are going down, and you have no chance of improving the standards or elevating the standards of protection unless you have some other form of alternative protection out there to take the heat off the investment side of it. And I think that's going to call for liability rules. I guess my question for Kevin would be, would you really object too much, even if it was between University A and University B, if you had to pay a small tithe to use the gene even for research purposes, but you knew you could use it, and it was an inter-university or a operation or a resource governed by the university and private sector protocol. And then to be really alarming, let me just say that you haven't seen anything yet, because this sort of stuff, which is really big and is bothering us all to death, has to do with what, a few hundred, a few thousand patents. Wait till you get an intellectual property right in collections of data, which they already have in Europe, which is coming through, which might even, I guess maybe the war will derail it, but we're scheduled to go through in April. And then you're going to find that after you publish the article, you still own the data, or after you go to the patent office and declare the patent, you still own the data that supports it. And everybody's going, if you think you've seen reach-through and all this sort of causes and struggles now, it's going to be titanic if we don't sort that out. And NIH is going to have super sharing models. And in the interest of shameless self-promotion, I would call your attention to the fact that Paul Euler and I have a very long, over 100-page article coming out now, supposed to be out now in the Journal of Law and Contemporary Problems on this subject called Contractually Reconstructed Public Domain for Scientific Data in a Highly Protectionist Intellectual Property Environment, in which we...
Did everybody get that?
Yeah.
Why is that 100?
I can't read the title. You want them to read 100 pages?
There was a lot of points there. I'm going to just two to address. So as Mark Rohrbaugh, the current director of the NIH's Office of Technology Transfer, likes to say about the March-In, that's when you're doing surgery, you need surgical tools, you don't need a sledgehammer. And so the March-In right is more like a sledgehammer. So that's really not effective, and it's never been used. And I don't think it's really any lack of will or perhaps administrative fumbling or something like that on the part of NIH. So, we use what we have. And certainly the NIH is very worried about the EU directive and database protection. We oppose the creation of new forms of IP, intellectual property protection for information or facts. I mean, that just goes against everything. From what we understand, we've been tracking this pretty closely, and it seems like that proposed legislation is dead, and it's not even going to be discussed in the current Congress. So.
My little anecdote to the licensing thing. I was at a meeting with the university council and a couple of contract officers, and it was a very simple task of how do you write a site contract for clinical research, and they had come up with 3 different positions. Their preferred position for some clause, their acceptable position, their base case, the lowest common denominator. I said, well, this doesn't make any sense to me. There's, you either believe something or you don't. There's either an ethical standard here or there's not. And if there's not, then why are you spending a lot of time on it? And the retort back was, well, because you want to negotiate over this, you want to lose, there's a negotiation opportunity. And at that point, that was my eureka moment when I realized people exist to negotiate these agreements, not to implement the agreements. And all these positions are out there to negotiate. And I, as an individual investigator, I don't mind if I had to pay 10 cents. The royalty, I mind the $4.55 per whatever that I have to pay. I've spent as much as 18 months on negotiating a research agreement for one contract. So I mind the barrier is not the license fee. The barrier is the process in which you have to line all this stuff up, and that process includes people who aren't all that educated about the issues. The science is moving so rapidly. If you start querying our tech transfer office, whether they understand where the science is, what these issues are, where the value is and not, it's just not on the radar screen. So I think the reality hits the road in terms of the process itself and how costly the process is, and not who's getting the dime at the end of it.
This question is for Ms. Driscoll and Dr. Thomas. You both mentioned a number of policies that your organizations support, such as, on paper in your stated goals, such as non-exclusive licensing or compulsory licensing. Obvious reasons, these policies are staunchly opposed by drug companies, and those drug companies have a lot of influence over policy. So I'm wondering how your organizations, the NIH, the Human Genome Research Institute, and the Nuffield Council use your influence to actively affect policy, to turn that support on paper into advocacy for those policies. Do your offices go beyond simply recommending those policies to work with governments and drug companies to make those happen? Or is that not the role of your group?
Well, I'm wearing two hats here. If I can respond in relation to Nuffield, I think it's a very legitimate question in terms of these reports are published. What do they amount to in terms of influence? And I think it's something we think about a lot. What has been and it varies. It varies according to the topic. I think it's fair to say that the patenting report has been read by a lot of relevant policymakers. And if I could use as one example. The Department of Health has endorsed a lot of those recommendations, for example, and there is one recommendation going before various committees in the Department of Health, which is suggesting that, or recommending even, that compulsory licensing should be pursued where there are problems, as in the case of potential problems, as in the case of diagnostics. So it's the take-up of those recommendations. It very much depends on the on political considerations. On a different note, I might say that the CIPR report, which was commissioned initially by a minister in a government white paper, is not terribly popular with the pharmaceutical industry, either in the US or in Europe. And I think it would be fair to say that pressure has been exerted on how far the government should go along with disseminating it, and is it an official government document? Questions have been asked by the pharmaceutical industry. Having said that, I think the ministry concerned, which has differed, which deals with overseas aid, has stood very firm that this is a document which is out there to promote discussion and to make recommendations, and it's not official government policy, but it is seen as an important airing of views that feed into, for example, the current debates within the WTO. So what you could say with that is that it's not possible for us to say whether that document is going to influence, say, UK government policy, but there are a number of fora in which those recommendations are being discussed at, and also in the columns of newspapers like the FT. And these topics, particularly in relation to compulsory licensing for drugs that are manufactured in countries like India and Brazil, this is very controversial because the pharmaceutical industry would very much like those public health emergencies, which are within the terms of the compulsory licensing, to be for the major infectious diseases and nothing else. Whereas what we have argued, for example, is that asthma is one condition that's going to become very important, and there may be very legitimate grounds for saying that's a public health emergency. These are obviously extremely, there's a great deal of tension here, I think, between what the global pharmaceutical industry wants and between what others see as a legitimate case for the public interest in developing countries. And at the moment, it's a stalemate. And there's not a lot that we can do as an ex-commission, essentially, except to encourage airing of those ideas at all the fora and in the media that we can. And I think it's fair to say that in this particular case, we are being listened to, but I wouldn't underestimate the interest of the pharmaceutical industry in being able to be influential in having their concerns also listened to at a very high level. So it's probably not a very satisfactory answer, but I tried to give you some insight into what we do with the actual paper reports.
Everybody tuckered out? Well, thank you all. We've had an incredible range of comments, and I especially thank Kevin and Henry and Claire for bringing up the rear and being willing to do that and allowing our other guests to get in and out. So thank you for being so generous with your time. Thank you and the audience for being so attentive, and we hope that you learned something that you can take away and find useful and that we'll do something with. Thank you.